Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Australian Society for Computers and the Law and Herbert Smith Freehills with the kind support of the University of New South Wales. Let's begin by acknowledging the First Nations people of each of the lands in which we meet. For me, I acknowledge the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. I also pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today we'll hear an opening address by Andrea Glorioso on insights from the European Commission on the future of work. Andrea joins us today from sunny Brussels and is the Policy Officer of the European Commission. Andrea plays a critical role in shaping Europe's digital future by advising the European Commission on digital policies, distributed technology, global standards and the socio-economic impacts of digitalisation across the European Union. After his opening remarks, Andrea will be interviewed by Michael Gonski. Michael is a partner of in the employment team of the leading law firm Herbert Smith Freehills and sits on the firm's Global Innovation Committee. He serves on numerous boards and is a member of the Australian Prime Minister's Community Business Partnership. We're keen to answer as many of your questions as possible and encourage you to put those into the Q&A function. Now over to you. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Marina. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for your very kind introduction, maybe even too kind. I wouldn't want viewers to perhaps overestimate my power to influence the European Commission, but indeed I have been working there and advising a number of decision makers there on a number of issues related to the social, political and economic impact of digital technologies. And most lately, after I concluded my 4 years diplomatic tour in the US, where I was posted to Washington, DC and had a lot of dealings with our American friends on digital technologies, I've been I've been focusing very much on the impact of digital technologies on labor relations. Now we'll start my remarks by pointing out that, as you might have heard, I tend to use the term labor relations rather than labor markets, even though I'm perfectly aware that that's the technical term that is normally used. And why I do that? Because even though indeed labor relations are to a large extent markets, there is a demand, there is an offer. In perfect conditions, there is a match, or there is as often a match as possible, which makes all the parties happy, or as we say in diplomatic circles, makes both parties or all the parties equally unhappy, which is also a good result in most cases. But I use the term labor relation because I think it's very important, especially in times of deep and profound changes, such as the ones that we're going through, not only due to digitalization, the rather mega drivers, as they're all mega trends, as they're often called, but I personally focus very much on digitalization. It's important in these times of change to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we are talking about human beings and work, jobs, labor on either side, on the side who offers the job or on the side who offers the labor. These are human beings. And I think there is a tendency sometimes, understandably, because at some point we need to look at these issues from a more technical perspective or more numerical perspective, if you will. As a civil servant, I'm perfectly aware that you need to also look at the macro picture of any policy areas we are considering. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't forget that what we discuss and what we decide has an impact on real people, on the relations, on the lives of real people. As I said, we are going through, I don't think it's what we believe, it's a fact that we're going through major transformations in labor relations throughout the world, including the European Union. What I think it's important to understand is that, from my perspective, the term that we use, that is used in this conversation, for the title of this conversation, that is also used by the European Commission, so it's not at all a criticism to you guys. This term, future of work, can be misleading, because this is not the future, it's the present. It's already happening. And as a matter of fact, it has been happening for some time, in the sense that some of the dynamics that we're looking at, that we're observing in labor relations as driven by digitalization, have in fact older and deeper roots than digitalization. They were accelerated by the introduction, by the massive introduction and uptake of digital technologies. But for example, to give a concrete example, the increasing flexibilization of labor relations is not at all due uniquely to digital technologies. Is due to economic pressure, is due to policy choices, is due to different legal models. And I'm not even arguing, as you might notice, whether that's a good or bad thing. There are pros and cons in this flexibilization. My point is that when we look at the impact, or at least when I look at the impact of digitalization on labor relations, I always try to remind myself, where is this coming from? What are the dynamics the deep dynamics that we should be really looking at, and how does digitalization impact those dynamics? Having said that, I do believe there is one peculiar element, or one element of these changes, one driver of these changes that is very peculiar to digital technologies, or to digitalization, in the sense that you couldn't realistically see the same effect without digital technologies, and that is about the use of data in labor relations. The way in which increasingly, not by the way, the shift to massive data or big data processing analysis is certainly not only present in labor relations, but that's the topic we're focusing in today. So I will stick to that. What we are seeing and what we have been seeing, particularly in the past 10 years, so that's a slightly more recent development than digital technologies as such. We are seeing an increasing use, also outside of the core tech sector, of data collected about workers' behavior, data collected about internal processes, data collected about sale and post-sale activities. And we're also seeing an increasing processing analysis, or increasing ability to process, analyze, and gather insights about all this data. As I said, I think this is very peculiar of digital technology, so you could not do that in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, not at the scale in which we, of the past century, not at the scale in which we're seeing it done today. And once again, this is not necessarily a bad thing, because to the extent that, for example, the collection and processing of data in the workplace can help an employer understand quickly that an employee is an at-risk subject from a point of view of burnout. So you can prevent those kind of situations, which are extremely difficult to assess in time. And the employer then, whether because he or she wants to, or because he or she is legally obliged to do it, takes measures to have better preventive measure. That's a great thing. That's positive, and we should encourage that. On the other hand, it's also true that this collection and analysis and processing of data can be done for slightly less noble purposes. Can be done by some employers, and unfortunately it has happened. It is happening. I'm not saying it's widespread across all employers, but we have seen examples to discriminate between employers. I'm aware of one case, which is, however, is sadly we probably go to court, so I'm not at liberty to go too much into the details, but let us just say that I'm aware of one case in which one employer, a largish company, ran a program gathering data and could basically assess before the workers themselves whether a worker was at risk for heart diseases, and took decisions in terms of whether to advance the career of that worker or not on that basis. And the workers were completely unaware of that. And as you can imagine, the labor unions, which are still pretty strong here in Europe, were not at all happy about that. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is digital technologies are driving a number of changes in labor relations. They are certainly pushing a number of what we could call middle skill professions. They're putting a lot of pressure on those kind of jobs because more and more we see that digital technologies, including through the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning sub-technologies, can replace a lot of jobs, a lot of repetitive, not particularly creative jobs. Those can be replaced by machines. It is then mostly an economic and policy decisions whether they will be replaced or not. But the technological reality is that those jobs, a number of jobs, either on the high end in terms of, I should say right from the start, when I say high end, middle level, low end, This is an assessment on the level of skills that are needed for certain jobs and the reflection of the wages that those jobs can command on the market. It is not a judgment on the dignity of any job. Any job, as far as I'm concerned, deserves the same, any worker deserves the same kind of respect. So I want to be very clear on this. Having said that, there are certain classes of jobs which require a lot more specialization in certain skills, creativity, empathy, group work, lateral thinking, we might say, which are very hard to automate. Personally, I think we will never truly automate them. And then you have a number of jobs which are in principle automatable, but it's just not worth the money to automate them because they already command very low wages. So to make a concrete example, we're not seeing, even though the technology is there, we're not seeing a lot of cleaners, office cleaners being replaced by machines because it's just not economically convenient to do it. So we are seeing this pressure on this particular category of jobs. So what is this producing? And for now, at least in Europe, it is, I wouldn't say it's a massive trend, just like it is in the US, for example, but we are seeing shifts in that direction. We are seeing as like polarization of, in this case, I will use the term, a polarization of labor markets. And now polarization and or paying different wages to different people, that is not a bad thing per se. It's unrealistic to expect that everybody can command the same kind of wages from a labor relation. But we know from political science, from comparative political science and from history that in any society, when societal polarization and labor polarization is quite a good predictor of societal polarization, when societal polarization reaches too much, it becomes too big, then you will have political issues, social and political issues. So I think it's in our interest to understand, and it's certainly something that the European Commission is doing. We look at digitalization and digital technologies, and we see that it can bring so much good, so much more efficiency in labor relations, so much innovation. It can solve real world problems. And I want to be clear, that is the absolute belief, official belief of the European Commission. Digitalization is good. We need more of that, and we need more investments there. But on the other hand, we also should not be naive and blind to the impacts, to the negative impacts that digitalization has, specifically, as this is the topic of today's conversation, on labor relations. And that's my personal hypothesis, that the main issue we should be looking at is indeed this polarization effect. And I will close these initial remarks, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with Michael, whom I thank for his time and insights already now. There is a quote from a writer of science fiction, William Gibson, that I always like to use, which is that the future is already here. It's just that it is not very evenly distributed. And I think that that is the key issue for us. It's not, it should not be a debate whether to accept or not digitalization. You do not accept or not progress. Progress happens, change happens, digitalization is happening. The real key issue for me personally, and I would say to a very large extent for the European Commission, although I cannot speak officially for the European Commission on this matter, but a real key and core issue is how do we distribute fairly for a particular definition of fair, which is a very thorny problem to solve, but how do we distribute fairly the benefits of digitalization, of technology in general, but of this digitalization more specifically. And with this, I think I will shut up, and I will be looking forward to the conversation with Michael.
Not at all. Thank you, Andrea. Very, very interesting. I've got to start today, given the fact that I think a lot of lawyers are going to be listening to this talk. Have you seen the website, which is willrobotstakemyjob.com?
I saw it, yes.
So as you know, going into deep preparation for today, I went to that website this morning and I looked up lawyer, and it says there's only a 4% chance that lawyers will be automated. And one, I think that's ridiculous. Two, I'm really disappointed because I'd hoped that you were going to tell me today that you were going to have some ideas for automation that might mean that I might not have to come to the office anymore. But I was actually interested, you know, for the people listening, I mean, things like law in particular, you know, do you actually believe that that's right, that is a job that's going to be so difficult to disrupt? I find it hard to believe, given there's at least a lot that should be automatable.
Yeah. Let me answer in two ways to your question, which I think is an absolutely good and fair and correct question to start with. First is that automation is only part of the digitalization trends that we're seeing. There are others, including the ability to better communicate, to better coordinate, or perhaps, as I personally have witnessed in this working from home environment, in which I guess many of us have been due to the sad reality of the pandemic. Sometimes, ironically, digitalization can lead to worse communication because it can lead to an overload of communication. I don't know about you guys, but I'm spending my days jumping from one online meeting to the other. So I will not spend too much time there, just to point out that, yes, automation is an important dimension when we discuss about digitalization and labor relations, but it's not the only one. Now, talking specifically about automation and whether lawyers are going to be all automated or not, when the debates on the academic debates on the impact of digitalization on labor relations first started, which I think, it's a bit difficult to put dates, but it was a few years ago, the first widespread or widely read papers, I think, was from 7 or 8 years ago. And the first papers, as it often happens in academic research, this is not a criticism, but they were very coarse and rough in modeling the impact of automation on jobs. And so what they basically did, much of this research, many of these models, they were basically looking at jobs as a monolithic, at each job as a monolithic entity, and then would run all kind of mathematical regression models and predictions of whether it could be automated or not. And this very easily led to overshooting the possibility of automating any particular job. And then academic research and our research and everybody's research got a bit better. And the focus now is really identifying within each job what are the tasks, what are the functions that can be more or less easily automated. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I work with lawyers, so I cannot really speak with much authority on what a lawyer does, but given my own experience with lawyers, lawyers do many different things. You have the legal assessment, you have sometimes the hand-holding of the board, you have sometimes litigation, you have sometimes other things. And so I think the question is, which of these various functions is more amenable to being automated than others? So again, we are building a very, very rough model here, so to speak, but I do believe that a lot of the legal research, at least looking at the results of the legal research that I receive when I ask questions, with all due respect, a lot of that legal research can and will be automated. Part of it is kind of the analysis of the lawyer, although much like economists or lawyers, usually when you ask a question to a lawyer, Michael, you tell me if I'm right, the answer is very often it depends. And then you have to go through all the cycles of identifying better what's the question. But interestingly, the first part of the analysis can probably be automated. But if I ask a machine to go more deeply, probably the machine will have difficulties. So there you need a human being to tell me that the answer to my question depends on something else, and then to work together to understand, okay, what does it depend from and what can we have. I talked about the hand-holding of the board, which was a slightly snarky, jokingly way to refer to lawyers and other figures have a role to kind of tell boards and C-suites and senior decision makers, look, I cannot give you a precise answer to this question, but my gut feeling, my experience is the following. That's a very emotional kind of job. There is a real emotional connection that doesn't mean that you like your interlocutors, but there is an emotional connection that takes place there. Machines will never replace it, but not because they are philosophically incapable of simulating emotions. It's because human beings do not like when machines simulate emotions to them. So I could go on, but I guess my point here, Michael, is my answer to your question is it depends. And it depends on which tasks specifically we are looking at. Clearly, there are professions which have a more limited number of easily identifiable tasks that will arguably be automated more easily, and that's where we are looking more carefully because those are probably the sectors and the industries and the workers which will need more support in the years to come.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because my own personal view has been when you talk about the hand holding of the board, well, I'd like to hold the hand of the board, but equally have the computer in my other hand, because I think if you're going to be providing things like your gut feel, well, imagine what your gut feel is like if you have every single case ever looked at a particular piece of, of evidence, and then you can say, well, great, market practice. Well, the computer's told me that 67% of the time this was the answer. I think if I'm a board, I'd like that a lot better than someone in a shiny suit just telling me to trust them because they've seen it before. So I think that will be really interesting. The other interesting part is I saw that PayPal, for example, has found that I think it was more than 50% of their disputes that they have can be solved literally between two parties with suggested responses. And I guess one of the things that I was interested in is, if I look at an M&A transaction, in it, obviously there will be a set of draft clauses that each firm will come up with. But I actually wondered whether if you looked over a period of time, there may be 8 to 10 permutations of each clause that is used relevantly. And I wonder how long it will be before those clauses are actually set out. And then, people will actually have to put in what is their relative bargaining power in a transaction. And a computer might say, great, well, based on your relative bargaining power, here are the clauses that I think you can put forward. And interestingly, I am not seeing any of that in day-to-day work at the moment, but equally, want to be front of mind to see it. So I guess my question to you then is, do you believe that that is a 3 to 5 year horizon, or maybe a 10 to 20 year horizon?
I think that, first of all, as I said, the future we are talking about is already happening now, because there are already a lot of jobs in which this sort of massive, and again, we are talking about automation, whether software-based or hardware-based, that's what I understand we're talking about here, but digitalization is a broader dynamic with other effects as well. But let's stick to this specific example that you're making. Those changes are already happening now. I think that in 3 to 5 years, what we're going to see, and please don't take this as the European Commission's prediction, that's Andrea Glorioso's prediction, but it is, I would say, fairly well-informed prediction, given all the things that I've seen and all the conversations I've had with the employers, labor unions, technologists, academics, etc. I think that in 3 to 5 years, we are certainly and definitely going to see a lot more use of computer-supported decisions, or computer-supported decision-making, much more than has been the case so far. Because you're absolutely right, Michael, that I myself, if I were a board member, I care only to a limited extent about the gut feeling of the person I have in front of me. It's not unimportant, because if I trust somebody, gut feeling is those things that you cannot really define and might have an impact, but I'm certainly not going to take major decisions only based on the gut feeling of whomever. So supporting your gut feelings with data is very important. How do you get the data? Of course, we need to have the tools and the techniques, the technology, and so on and so forth. And we're going to see a lot more than that. But again, to go back to one point that I made at the very beginning, computer-aided decisions are not a new thing, certainly not in research. They have been used, for example, in medical practice for a very long time to guide medical doctors, sometimes in very complex decisions, helping them build a decision tree. But at the end of the day, it was always the medical doctor who took the decision. I think that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a lot more of this. I never like to make prediction of more than 5 years, because I think that things change too quickly and too massively to make good prediction. And I always like to go back, as I've been in this field, in the technology field for quite a longish time. Sometimes I like to go back and read what people said in 2000 that would happen in 2020. And it's very funny sometimes what people predicted back then. Beyond the 5 years horizon, as I said, I don't want to make predictions, but I think we can say that unless we put in place appropriate policy and potentially regulatory measures, I'm not a fan of regulation, but sometimes you do need it, we might, purely because of economic convenience, we might see a shift towards too much reliance on data-driven decisions. And that I don't think it would be a good idea, because at the end of the day, data does not tell us anything. Data does not speak. It's us who interpret data, and then sometimes we want the data to say something, and we really massage the data until it says what we want, but it's always us doing it. And what I'm a bit afraid of is that in these automation processes, in these data-driven tasks, which are good, as I said, we might end up, beyond the 5 years horizon, we might end up relying a bit too much on data. I'm not that familiar with the job of a lawyer, but look, for example, what's happening in the job, or what has changed in the job of a law enforcement official, the policeman. More and more, their job is driven by data. I have nothing against predictive analysis if it's used in a smart way, but when the reliance on data becomes too much and predictive analysis becomes a kind of science fiction or science dystopia, a science dystopia scenario, then there we have we do have problems. We do have an issue.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So I guess then coming to, if we are thinking that this digitalization is coming so quickly, what is your view on, I guess, the difference between, I guess, capitalism as we have it now versus that idea of a universal wage, and the, is there going to be a requirement for a universal wage if we really don't need jobs and they will all be taken by computers?
Look, I think that the death of jobs have been massively overestimated. I don't think jobs are going to disappear. Also because historically, if you look at all major technological transformations from time immemorial, but certainly if you look at the first and second industrial revolution, the so-called computer revolution in the 70s, there were always these predictions of massive job destruction on a macroeconomic scale, and that's not what happened. So look, I cannot predict the future, but I think it's fair, with this kind of historical data in our hands, if somebody claims that all jobs are going to disappear, I think the onus is on that person to prove that this is actually going to happen, because this is not what we have seen, certainly for the first, second industrial revolution and for the computer revolution. That does not mean that those transition, those technological changes did not imply massive societal and political transition. I mean, communism as a political ideology was born because of the Industrial Revolution. So I don't know which kind of ideology might become predominant because of the changes that we're going through, but I know for a fact that there will be massive, they're already happening in fact, but there will be massive changes in the political and societal landscape as we know it. Now, if you look at things from this perspective, the debate about, you call it universal wage, I assume you refer to what here on this side of the world we tend to call universal basic income. Are we talking about the same thing, Michael?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Yes, okay. I think the main issue with the discussions of universal basic income is that the definition of what is a universal basic income changes depending on whomever you're talking to. I've seen at least 10 different versions of what is a universal basic income. Having said that, the idea that if we are facing a massive transformation of labor relations and societies, and this will put a relatively large number of people out of jobs, then we do need, and as you know, in Europe, we have a tradition of social capitalism, or whatever you want to call it. So we have open markets and capitalism, but we also have a very strong welfare state all across Europe. So if we're moving towards this massive shift, and digitalization is a driver of this shift, it's quite clear that we will need massive and very active social welfare policies, probably more than we have at the moment. Whether that means that everybody should be paid a certain amount of money, sorry. And again, there you have different versions of UBI, universal basic income. Some say, well, that should be the case only for people who don't have a job. Some say, which is not universal actually. Some say only for people who don't have a job and are looking for a job, which is not very different than a lot of other active social policies that we have to support unemployed people. Some even say, well, everybody, from Mark Zuckerberg to the last migrant here should receive the same amount of money, which strikes me as not very fair and not very smart. So to answer your question, if the debate about universal basic income can be turned into a broader debate on how we need to adapt our social protection systems to face with a new reality in which we will probably have a lot more flexibility in labor relations, so people changing jobs much more rapidly. And we need people to upskill and reskill themselves much more continuously throughout their career, and they need support for that. If that is the debate, I think it's a very necessary, interesting debate. I will confess, Michael, that speaking very personally, the other debate about the rest of the debate about UBI, it's not that it doesn't interest me. I'm a political scientist by training, so almost everything interests me by definition. But I find it challenging to really pinpoint what exactly is it that we should be talking about, we should be discussing. Maybe in a few years' time, as these discussions mature, we will get to a point where we actually understand. Here in Europe, I don't know the situation in Australia, but hopefully we'll get to a point here in Europe where we understand each other when we talk about universal basic income.
That's interesting. I mean, so one thing in Australia that we're going through at the moment is, we do not have legislation that deals with the gig economy. And our legislation that relates to contract workers and casual workers is so antiquated that right now we're in a very strange time where the government hasn't legislated and businesses are caught in a funny quagmire where they're not sure how they're meant to pay people, but equally in the way the case law is set up, they probably are meant to pay people like employees rather than contractors. But if you actually went through every business and applied that, then I think that the sheer number of jobs that would be lost in order for businesses to stay alive would just not make sense. So I'm quite interested in your view, I guess, number one, in relation to gig economies in general, as to whether you think they've actually been a good thing or a bad thing in relation to the workers that work on those platforms.
It depends. Look.
You're going to become a lawyer by the end of this.
Yes. I learned the ropes. I've worked with many lawyers, so I learned the ropes of how to answer, to bid your time as you try to find an answer to a very, again, fair and interesting question. First and foremost, our assessment of the size of the gig economy in Europe is that it is quite limited. If you look at the number now, it's difficult to get data, so we have to rely very much on proxies and the like. But our assessment is that we are not talking about a massive number of workers employing these kind of platforms to work. Depending on how you look at it, it's between 3 and 7% of the workforce. It's not nothing, to be clear, and independent of their number, those people deserve dignity and protection and all of that, but still it's not something, and we don't see it. It rose, gig work rose very quickly between 2000 and I would say 14 and 15. It seemed for now to have reached a kind of a plateau, at least in Europe. Maybe things will change. So this is the first thing. Secondly, has it been a good thing or not? Well, look, Michael, I think that if you're unemployed and you need to pay your bills, if you are, for example, a student and you want to kind of have some money at hand, well, then gig work is potentially a very good solution. It gives you flexibility, it gives you money. Depending on the nature of that particular gig work, it might even be something that you like. That depends very much on what we're talking about. So I wouldn't say it's a bad thing. However, I think it's very, I'm using a strong word, but I deeply believe it's very dangerous if we think that all the labor relations can be turned into gig relations. That is not sustainable. It's not sustainable, certainly not for the workers, because right now our society still, to an extent that people don't even realize, it relies on the assumption that you're either a freelancer, a true freelancer, or you're an employee. Those non-standard forms of work are very hard to fit into a lot of other day-to-day relations, including, for example, getting a loan from a bank. The bank will ask you will probably not give a loan if you are a gig worker. They don't even know what it means. But it's not even in the interest, in my opinion, it's not even in the interest of employers Because if you're really trying to build, that's my belief at least, if you're trying to build a productive business, especially in times such as today, where to a large extent due to digitalization, but you're looking for quite skilled and very specialized figures, I think you want to build a relationship of trust with that employee or with that worker, whether it's an employee or not, with that worker, because having one worker and then replacing with one worker, there is a whole stage of training and retraining and getting to know the organization and the unspoken processes that takes a lot of time. And I'm sure there are a few companies out there which don't care and they just want to use people in whichever way they want. And if that's their business model and it's legal, fair enough. That is not the case for most of the successful companies that I know. They do want to build relationship. Again, that's why I talk about labor relationships and not about labor market. The other point, which I think we need to be a bit careful when we talk about gig work, is, and it's related to this, is 2 points, in fact. The first, which is a very digitally specific point, is the fact that platform-mediated gig work, because let's not forget that gig work existed before the internet, before digital technologies. It was just not called gig work, but it was there. But online platform-mediated gig work relies to a very large extent on a very sophisticated collection and analysis of data by the platform. Data about the skills of the workers, the demand, the supply, sometimes for certain kinds of gig work, also by the tasks themselves. There are certain types of gig work where the platform literally monitors your screen and the worker's screen and checks very carefully what's happening. Who has the property of the data? Who has rights over the data? Is it the worker's data? Is it well, it's not an employer, but is it, let's say, the business data? Is it the platform's data? So there's a question there. There are questions there that we do need to address. And then there is another issue, which is not so much related to digital, but I will mention it nonetheless. What you want to avoid is a situation, we are seeing a few cases, is a situation in which somebody starts a gig work for whatever reason, and then is stuck in that gig work. Is stuck because it's not earning, he or she is not earning enough to train or to kind of learn the new skills that are needed, but he or she needs that money. That is not an ideal, and again, this is absolutely without prejudice to the fact that any kind of job, any kind of work deserves dignity, deserves respect. But I think that in many cases, people do not get onto the whole gig work thing because they want for 30 years of their life to do that gig work thing. It's most of the times as a temporary thing. So we need to make sure we create the conditions to keep it temporary. Interestingly, it's usually the companies providing these matching gig work matching services. They will be the first to say they don't want their users to be stuck on the platform. They don't think it's good business for them to have people doing for too long this kind of gig work. At least the companies I've been talking to. They will not say it publicly, by the way, but behind closed doors, they express this kind of views.
So now I think we'll move on to, we have a whole bunch of questions coming in from the people watching us. I don't know about you, I presume there must be 10,000 people in a stadium somewhere watching us. So I'm surprised, that there's not, pages and pages of questions. But I think the ones that are sort of top rating at the moment, which I thought might be worth going through. One in particular, which I find very interesting, is about machine learning and the fact that, machines can only learn from the past, and obviously you need to project in relation to the future. How are we going to avoid things like biases? And, if you can draw a little bit on, I'm so fascinated by, in our businesses, we've spent, millions of dollars, and I think it's been brilliant on trying to look at issues like unconscious bias of humans. But really, you look at the simplistic nature of a computer, I would have thought as a premise that they will have much larger biases than a human.
That's a fantastic question that could lead us really down the rabbit hole, because there's so much to be said about this. I really try, and I rely on you, Michael, to block me if you see that I'm going in too many directions. So I will try really to stick mostly to the dimensions we're talking about, so the labor dimensions. But I will say something about the more general issue. First and foremost, and you said it yourself, Michael, we should judge the bias in machine learning systems, which are often called artificial intelligence systems, although artificial intelligence is actually a broader category than just machine learning. Machine learning systems can, and in most cases, are biased, but human beings are very biased as well. And in most cases, and again, you said it, Michael, we are not even, actually, in almost the totality of cases, we are not aware of our biases at all. And so when we judge the higher or lower degree of bias than a machine learning solution, for example, applied in the hiring process, when we judge whether that machine learning solution is biased, that's a very important question to ask and to answer, but we should also ask how biased was it when human beings were doing were the only actors in the hiring process, and similar consideration could be said for almost all elements of the labor relation. Having said that, I do think that in this, as in many cases, the IT industry, which is an industry I love, I've been working in it for, I would say, the totality of my life in one way or the other before becoming a civil servant, and I think IT holds great promises for humanity. But having said all of this, I think that very often the digital industry, the tech industry, the ICT industry, whatever you want to call it, is its own worst enemy. Because what happened in the past 5 or 6 years is that industry has oversold the capabilities of artificial intelligence systems. I think it's mostly the marketing departments of those companies and of the engineers in those companies, when they saw the advertising coming out of their own companies, were like, oh my God, don't say that. Our systems cannot do that and will never be able to do that. But that's what happens, that's the reality. And this has generated a lot of concerns in policymakers, in common people, in citizens, in companies using these solutions. I don't think there is an easy way out of this, except to, and that's what in the Commission we've been supporting for the past 2 years through various means. So we supported an independent expert group. We supported the development of a kind of an internal assessment checklist. It's important to be clear on, one, what are the core principles in using certainly artificial intelligence technologies, I would say any technologies, what are the ethical principles that you really want to stick to, or at least you want to think about. Principles such as accountability, transparency, all of which requires to some extent explainability, the ability to explain why you reach a certain decision. And again, explainability is very difficult also for human beings. If somebody asks me why you said what you said in that particular moment, I might have a rational idea why I said it. That might not be the true reason why I said what I said. So all of this is fiendishly difficult. But I think we are expecting a little bit from certain organizations which produce machine learning systems, including for the workplace, for labor relations, is that they make an effort, which I think to a large extent they are doing, in building internal, being more transparent. That's very, very important on what that technology can or cannot do, and B, in building internal control system, to use a bit of an auditing terminology, so that at every point of the process in which, or the processes in which they're using this technology, this machine learning technology, they can at least ask themselves the right questions. Is this machine learning technology going too far? Is it giving us results which they seem suspicious? This all seems very obvious, Michael, but I have seen, and it always happens with new technologies. There has been a moment, and maybe it's happening even now, when these technologies were used, were just, somebody went to the Vice President for Human Resources and said, we have this cool new technology that will allow us to screen 10 times as many applicants as we were doing before, and it will cost us 1/10 of the budget. Should we use it? And probably the Vice President for Human Resources would say, why are you even asking? Go for it. You need to ask a certain number of questions before you actually deploy those technologies. I think that's the best we can do at the moment, because the reality is that this is still the whole area of explainable machine learning is still a fascinating, but quite, I would say it's a fascinating and promising, but still not super mature area of research.
Wow, thank you. That is very, very interesting. One I've been thinking about a lot, which actually one of the questions that's come through deals on. Do you at your home have an Amazon Alexa or a Google Home? Do you trust having one of those in your house?
So I used to have an Alexa, when I lived in the US, in Washington, DC. I was actually one of the first beta testers, and I stopped doing it for 3 reasons. So I don't own any of those instruments right now. So I stopped using my Alexa for 3, even though it was massively cool and my kids loved it, but I stopped using it for 3 reasons. The first step, and you will laugh, but it is an issue, it could not understand my accent. And it was extremely frustrating to keep on repeating to Alexa things. And then my significant other, who's American, would come and say exactly the same thing to my ear that I said, and Alexa would just snap to command. And that just drove me completely crazy. Now, this is funny, but on the other hand, it started to make me think is, wait a second, why does, in this particular case, Amazon, but I'm sure you could make very similar considerations from all the other companies, which assumptions are these companies making on the target demographic of their tools? And if they assume that everybody speaks perfect American English, which seems to be the case, which is absolutely not the case even in the US, and very often speaking or not speaking perfect American English is very much tied to your social income, to your income, for example, because recent immigrants who don't speak perfect American English tend to have. So which other assumptions are companies making when they train their so-called AI systems? We later discovered that, and that's the second reason why I stopped using those systems. They're called AI systems, but the reality is that there is a lot of unseen human intervention in the day-to-day operations of systems like Alexa or Siri or others. There are entire troops, squadrons of subcontractors someplace in the Philippines or in India, which are actually listening to what you are saying in order to train the machine. That was the second reason why I stopped using those systems. And the third reason why I stopped using those is because at some point I realized that, at least for me, I was becoming too much dependent, or I was not ready to have my day-to-day life too much dependent on non-interoperable proprietary systems under the almost entire control of business. And by the way, it didn't matter that the business was American or European or Chinese. That has never been a consideration for me. But I think there is an issue, and it does relate to the topic of our conversation, because as the digital infrastructure becomes essential, or some people tell us it has become essential, Alexa is not essential to be entirely, or Siri, they're not essential, they're nice to have. But there are other technologies which in our day-to-day jobs are becoming essential, absolutely essential. We cannot work anymore the way we do. Who controls those technologies? Who controls the data that feeds those technologies? If it's not the worker, if it's not the employer, it's somebody else. If it's not the public, the state, the government, whatever you want to call it, it's another entity. What is the relationship with that entity? And I think these are very important questions that we should ask ourselves, because as long as that means that I decide not to use Alexa, fair enough. But if that means, for example, that entire industrial sectors become much less productive because they need to switch away from a particular technology because the terms and conditions of the use of that technology have become too onerous for them, that's a very different matter. But to answer your question, the reason why I'm not using any more Alexa is, I will confess, mostly because it couldn't understand me, and that became very, very frustrating for me. But to be fair, I have another Irish friend who had exactly the same problem. Alexa did not understand Irish English, the Irish accent either. I don't know how it fares with the Australian accent. You tell me, but both I and my Irish friend, we had serious problems with that.
Well, you'll be happy to know my 2-year-old is also struggling at the moment trying to get Google to turn Lion King, but I think she's getting pretty close. Now, we've only got 10 minutes, and I know that Marina's got some things to talk about as well, but I just thought the last question I always like to ask in an interview is, what is the question that I should have asked you that I didn't? Because I really don't want to miss out on that one.
That's a tough question, because I think your questions were all very good and to the point. Maybe what you might have asked me is, what do I think, I'm really leading on this, but what do I think could be the political consequences for us as democracies if we don't act massively and decisively into addressing these changes, the negative effects of the changes brought upon by digitalization in labor relations. And I will answer my own question if you don't mind, Michael. I guess that was the point of,
yeah,
of this.
I might switch off now.
Yeah. I think we need to be extremely careful, because what I think we are underestimating, and again, that's the reason why I like to talk about labor relations and not labor markets. When you're a child and somebody asks you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Answering, which I did when I was a child, giving a perfectly logical answer, which was, I want to be happy, is not an acceptable answer, as I discovered very early, because people expect you as a child, the answer to the question to be what job you want to do. There's nothing wrong with that, but what this means is that we associate, our societies associate our jobs, the job we have, our work, very much with our own individual identity. And this is a very well-known phenomenon in sociological research, that the worst thing of losing a job is not the economic effects of it, but it's the self-respect effect that it has on people losing jobs. Now, as we move towards, I don't think it's going to happen to that extent, but there is a risk of large sectors of the economy seeing significant job losses, or certainly job changes, which, however, in the short term will be job losses as people transition from one job to the other. There is a moment in which those people don't have a job, and that is going to be, I don't think, as I said, jobs will disappear, but it's going to be substantial. How will people react? How are people reacting today to that, to the fear of that happening? And what we are seeing, certainly in Europe, but I think Europe is not the only part of the world where that is happening, is that, as it's, again, very, very common, and political science research has seen it time and again, people tend to react by looking for the easy, comforting answers. And those easy, comforting answers tend to come from certain political leaders, and tend to be, well, there is no problem. We just need to kick out all the brown people. We just need to close all our borders. We just need to, it's always somebody else's problem. And if you get rid of that somebody else, then your job problems will be solved. I confess I am very worried about that, because unless we build a realistic, positive narrative on how the realistic means, without forgetting the negative parts, on how digitalization can help not the people who use Twitter, not the people who use Facebook. All due respect, I mean, to some extent it's good we have those tools, but how digitalization can help the taxi driver, how it can help the coal miner, how it can help the school teacher, and so on and so forth. If we don't do that, we are to some extent doing that, but if we don't accelerate that building of a positive, realistic narrative, I am honestly afraid of what this would mean in terms of political choices of people. And as we've seen in many countries in the world, that is not theory. That is a reality that is already happening. So that's the question you were too diplomatic to ask me right from the start, Michael.
I think it's great. Well, I just have to thank you, so much for your time. It's been extremely interesting. We didn't even get to go into why you're wearing a Gold Coast shirt, which I think of a lot of interest to everybody.
That's it. Yes. Yeah. It's a gift from my father, who used to be very passionate about sailing. But don't ask me where exactly this shirt comes from. I'm not aware of that. We should ask my father. I will ask him, and I will let you know, Michael.
Well, I think post-COVID, when Queensland finally opens its borders and lets us in again, well, hopefully we'll be able to do this again in person. But I just want to thank you. And from the 10,000 people watching, I'm sure they're clapping virtually. Now, Marina, I think you had a few closing words that you had, but really appreciate it.
Thanks to you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's Marina here. What a wonderful presentation. I could have listened to you both for hours. Thank you, Andrea, for making the time for us, and Michael, of course, for your time and expertise. Fabulous. There's just one short announcement that we'd like to make. We felt that at the Australian Society for Computers and the Law, that once you heard that your jobs might be at stake and that we have to get all digital, that you would like to have some extra skills as lawyers. So we have a skills workshop, which you can see on the screen there, the speakers, fabulous panel looking a bit at the coding of law and where that might take us. So please join us on the 30th of September. It's a complimentary session and we'll love to see you there. Again, thank you, Andrea and Michael. Please stay online, and for the rest of you, have a wonderful afternoon or evening or even morning if you're dialing in from Brussels. Take care and see you soon.